Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the ResearchWorks podcast.
Yes, it's that time of the week again.
It is
Welcome
indeed.
back, everyone. And we are so excited to have on the show with us today the fabulous Dr. Yannick Bleyenheuft. Welcome, Yannick.
Welcome.
Thank you, and thanks for having me.
Thank you for putting up with the terrible pronunciation of your surname.
You did quite good, but she's laughing, so maybe you're not as good as we thought.
No, that was good.
Well, yeah, thank you so much for joining us, Yannick. We're so excited to be able to talk to you today about one of your articles that was published in 2021, and it was titled Brain Activation Changes Following Motor Training in Children with Unilateral Cerebral Palsy, an fMRI study. And this was published in Annals of Physical and Rehabilitation Medicine, which sounds very impressive.
It does, doesn't it?
It does.
All really good words there.
Yes, and I'm sure lots of hard work went into that paper, Yannick, which we're going to get to in a little bit. But first, we're going to tell our listeners a little bit more about you, Yannick. So, Yannick Bleyenheuft is a faculty member at the University Catholique de Louvain Institute of Neuroscience in Belgium. She was trained as a physiotherapist and completed her PhD in the field of motor control in children with cerebral palsy in 2009 at UCL. She completed her postdoctorate, sharing her time between UCL and Columbia University, which is in New York, very exciting, working on intensive rehabilitation processes for children with cerebral palsy. In 2014, she was appointed as the tenured chair for neurophysiological evidence in intensive neurorehabilitation at the Institute of Neuroscience, UCL. And Yannick is now the head of the Motor Skill Learning and Intensive Neurorehabilitation Lab at UCL, which was developed in 2015. That all sounds very impressive.
Pretty impressive indeed. I think that just speaks to the breadth of work that you do. And that's why we're so excited to speak with you.
Yeah. I'm curious, Yannick, with our podcast, as you know, we like to ask an icebreaker question, and we've got an interesting one today. So the question today is, if you could hang out with any cartoon character, who would that be and why?
Well, that's probably the hardest question of today, right?
I'm sure it is.
Yeah. It was it was very hard to choose. Well, actually, my heart balances between having advices from Mulan on how to survive in a work environment full of strong men.
Oh my gosh.
Or to spend a few hours with the beauty reading in that fantastic huge library of books.
Oh, Belle from Beauty and the Beast. Oh, I love that.
Gorgeous. I love that so much. And Mulan. Oh my
You see
goodness.
the big library? It's absolutely fantastic.
Oh,
yes.
When I was a child, Yannick, I used to have dreams about a library like that in my house. It would have... But that was my favorite part of the movie, was all the time she got to spend in the library looking at all those beautiful books and climbing the ladders.
Exactly.
And sliding along.
So you see on my back that I have a small one. Not quite like that, but
That's beautiful.
It's a start, right?
Very impressive.
That was well thought through, actually. I really like that one. Good question. So I'm going to go to Winnie the Pooh land, and, you've got all your characters, and you go, well, do I want to hang out with Piglet? Well, Piglet's gorgeous, but just a little bit anxious, and I think that might make me feel a little bit anxious. And then there's Eeyore, of course, but, he's just a little bit sad.
Bit melancholy.
A bit melancholic, that's right. And so I thought, well, it has to be Tigger. I would have to say Tigger, because I would love to see his world being so excited and passionate about something every single day. But the best part would be if I could get like a springy tail as well. That'd be amazing. Just to see the world from his perspective. Just
bouncing around on his Tigger tail.
Yeah, that's right. And he's in everyone's business, so you'll see what's going on, and he moves fast enough to see what's happening. Yeah.
I was about to do an impersonation, but I know what happens to people on this podcast who do impersonations. So,
oh, you mean it ends up on a story of some sort? True. That was good though. What about you? What cartoon character?
Well, I have spent a lot of time with cartoon characters very recently. I have children who regularly requests to watch cartoons, and in particular Disney movies. And one of the household favourites at the moment is Moana. And I just find Moana very impressive. She's just got a can-do attitude.
Yes.
But, you know, with the relaxed island vibe.
Totally.
And so I think I'd like to hang out with Moana.
That'd be really cool. And then she can move the water.
Smooth sailing.
Smooth sailing.
Yeah, I am prone to ocean sickness.
She'll just be like,
so that would be quite handy if she could just, you know, if we could go for a nice little boat ride and she could just keep everything nice and calm.
I like it. I like that. I think I'll probably watch all those movies this weekend.
I'm going to go back and watch Mulan now.
Yeah, I love it.
It's been a long time.
Oh, I watched that last week. I don't have kids, but I still love watching Mulan.
Love that.
The cartoon version, not the real action one.
Oh, I didn't know there was.
Oh, there was. It's not as good as you like to think it would be. They have no songs in it. They don't sing.
Oh.
I was very disappointed. Reflections, like there's so many good things you could take out of that. But I digress.
Shall we get into the study?
Let's get into it. Let's talk about the brain activation. All right, here we go. This study aimed to determine whether hand-arm bimanual intensive therapy, including lower extremities, also known as HABIT-ILE, I've also called it HABIT-ILE, I've heard different versions, but I'll say HABIT-ILE, induces brain activation changes and whether these changes are related to functional changes observed after HABIT-ILE. So in a group of 25 children with unilateral spastic cerebral palsy who were assessed in manual dexterity and everyday activities before and after HABIT-ILE, the results indicated that brain activation changes were observed in the fronto-parietal network, underlying motor skill learning, with 2 patterns being observed, which were likely to be related to different phases of motor learning. So an increased practice-dependent brain recruitment or brain activation refinement by more efficient means.
Okay, I'm excited to unpack what all of that means.
Yes.
But before we do that, Yannick, our audience is quite familiar with cerebral palsy. It's been a regular topic on our podcast through each of the seasons that we've done now. So we thought it would be really nice to start by having you talk to us about motor skill learning principles and the relationship they have with neuroplasticity. So, you know, neuroplasticity is a term that people use quite frequently, but what are we actually referring to when we talk about neuroplasticity?
Okay, so I'm going to start with the first part of the question. So motor skill learning principle. Actually, it's a group of principles that have been demonstrated as having an impact on learning new motor tasks and generating neuroplasticity. So they include the use of shaping. What is shaping? It's a progressive increase in difficulty. Like, for instance, if you imagine that you want to learn how to play cello, let's say. Yeah. Well, you're not going to start with something very complex. You will start with something like it's very basic, and progressively you will increase the difficulty of the music you will play. That's right?
Yeah.
It includes also positive reinforcement, so in a very nice way, especially for children, systematically supporting the trials and so on. And high intensity of intervention with repetitive practice. Yeah. So if you apply this, it has been shown both in humans but also in animals that actually you will allow the individual to learn a new motor task, and that usually you will see that you have a fast improvement in the skill performance at the start, and then you will progressively reach asymptotic levels when you arrive towards the end. So how is it related to neuroplasticity, or what is neuroplasticity? Well, it is generating neuroplasticity. And what is neuroplasticity? It's actually an enduring change in a neuron or its function, or a group of neurons, let's say. And here in this study, neuroplasticity, but what we expect is to find some reorganization, sorry for my accent, of cortical representation of the extremities, and possibly synaptogenesis associated in the motor cortex.
I think it's good to flesh that out sometimes, isn't it?
Definitely. Yeah. So, just to kind of bring that down to its most simplistic form, because that's how I normally understand things, we're talking about, building complexity in a skill that someone's performing, that gradual build in the difficulty of a task that someone's performing, and then having lots of opportunity to practice that task. And those two things combined lead to these changes in how our brain is wired, basically.
Yeah, how it's organized and yeah.
Yeah, exactly. In the context where you are motivated. That's really the point.
Yes. Yeah, because it's really hard to do a task, over and over again if it's not something that you're particularly engaged with. You're not likely to get that dosage, are you?
That's it.
And there's that component of, just on that point there, of being motivated. I like how you brought that up. So motivation not only describes our desire to want to learn to be able to do it, but is there more to motivation in terms of neuroplasticity?
Well, actually, the motivation will depend on who actually is in the process.
Yeah.
So for a very young child, motivation might be really like, playing a very simple game that the child likes very much.
Yeah.
Or sometimes children are really motivated to, we want them to learn how to grab something with food that they like very much. So that can be.
Yep.
But for older children, motivation is driven both by the fact that the game is fun, but also by the fact that they choose their goals and they are motivated to reach those functional goals.
Yeah, sure. That's a really good point. So what would we hope to see from a neuroimaging perspective when we're talking about neuroplasticity?
So essentially, when we observe changes after an intervention with tools such as functional MRI, neuroplasticity should be highlighted by a change in brain activity.
Right.
So we can expect either an increase in the activity of the brain or a decrease in the amount of activity.
Right.
Interesting.
Isn't it so good?
Yeah.
And when you think about that for myself, when you are learning new things, you feel tired. If your brain feels tired, if that's even a thing to describe. I think we can all relate to that. There is this element of it. But it's interesting that neuroimaging picks up on that. In your paper, Yannick, you refer to the 2 phases of motor skill learning, which I loved because I was automatically thinking about that for myself when I'm learning, which is associated with different brain activation patterns. Can you please describe that in a bit more detail for us? I find that so interesting.
Yeah, actually, it's from studies done in adults without lesion, and that this has been defined. And actually, when people learn a new task, a new motor task, there are 2 phases.
Yeah.
The first one is an early phase that leads to an increase in brain activation.
Yeah.
So when you really are at the start of learning something new, like maybe you can remember when you started driving, right?
Yes.
Yes.
It was like awfully difficult, so much things to manage in a motor point of view. It's like you can imagine that you need to increase a lot your brain activation to manage the motor component of it.
Yes.
And then in later phases, when the task is more automatic, your brain activation is decreased. And that's obvious if you think about the driving stuff, because now when you drive, you can hear the radio and then discuss with someone next to you and manage your kids on the back seat to be sure they're okay, and still driving comfortably and respecting all the rules while driving. And that's because the component related to the motor activity needed, the brain activation needed for driving per se, managing the car, is really decreased.
Yeah.
It's kind of a refinement of the activity.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. I mean, you can relate to that so easily.
Definitely. That's such a brilliant example of how those principles work in practice. And I was actually also thinking about, when I was younger, I learned to play tennis, and thinking about the tennis serve, and when I first started, all those different components, where do my feet go? How do my hips line up? Where do my shoulders go? Where, how do I throw the ball up in the air? All those different things that you have to pay attention to and really concentrate and think about that become so much more automatic the more practice you have and the more opportunities you have to perform that skill.
That's so good, and I love that you can
and
relate
at that point, then you can, you can develop a strategy.
Yes.
You can be focused on something totally different.
Yes. Yeah, you can think about where you actually want the ball to go.
It's not just making contact. It's strategy.
Yeah.
No, that's a really good
what the
example.
score is in the game and things like that.
True, all the other elements. No, that's a really good point. That's a good example, Ash. Yeah. I need to see the serve of yours.
One day.
Okay.
We won't bring any cameras out. So Yannick, up to the point that you actually completed this study, what did we know about neuroimaging and what that looks like for children with CP prior to your work coming out?
Well, imaging with fMRI, so functional MRI, there were only a few studies, and they were all studies based on constraint-induced movement therapy, so CIMT.
Mm-hmm.
And these studies focused really on the primary motor and sensory cortex. So the specificity of the CIMT is that, of course, you just use the more affected hand. So you can only monitor what happens when using the more affected hand.
Yep.
And these studies reported an increase of brain activation of the primary motor cortex. So on the lesions hemisphere after intervention, and a decrease in the activation of the non-lesioned sensory motor cortex.
Right.
That's what was found. It was also suggested that the increase or decrease in activity might be related to the corticospinal tract organization. But it was hard to say really for sure, because this study were really conducted on a few children. So it was always based on a few cases and not easy to really have some strong evidence, I would say.
Okay. Well, that's really interesting. And I guess that leads us perfectly into your study. So what was the aim of your study in particular?
So the aim of the study was really to investigate the changes in activation in a larger group of children with unilateral CP. And we choose to do it after HABIT-ILE. So it means not focusing just on one hand, but having a training that is bimanual and locomotor. But in the brain, we will focus a lot on the hand response. And And we also wanted to focus on the complete cortical network for motor skill learning, not just on the primary motor and sensory cortex, but really on the whole network that is related to the manipulation. And finally, we wanted to study both hands separately and also the both hands combined.
Wow, that's a big job.
That's a big job indeed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm sure we'll get to it in a little bit, but I'm interested to hear more about, I suppose, how you actually did that within the fMRI. But before we get to that, can you tell us a bit about the children who were participants in your study, some of the characteristics of your sample?
Yeah. Well, actually, initially there were 29 children with unilateral CP, but the image quality allowed us to analyze the pre-post data of 25 children. And these children had I would say a regular profile for children with unilateral CP. So they had a max and a GMFCS levels 1 or 2. And they were aged between 6 and 16 with a mean age of 8.5.
Right. Okay. It's a good picture already. Yeah. So these kids then, obviously the more of that school age population, can you describe to us what was involved in this intensive training that you developed?
Yeah, sorry. So the training was quite intensive. So it was 9 hours a day for 10 consecutive days. So it was 90 hours. And so HABIT-ILE, it's bimanual structured task with a continuous simultaneous lower extremity stimulation. So it's both, it's a combination of bimanual and locomotor all the time with a motor engagement time higher than 70%. So it means we want the children to be involved actually and doing things that are useful for their training, being active for more than 70% of the time they are in the training. Which is a lot. And actually it is also there is a shaping, so it is also graded. So there is this progressive increase in difficulty. The goals are set by children and parents. And we add one therapist, so we say one interventionist, at least for each child. And the therapy was guided by trained supervisors.
Okay. Yeah, that's very comprehensive. Thank you. Can you tell us a little bit more about the dosage involved with HABIT-ILE? Like, I think lots of people would hear, 9 hours a day for 10 days and think, wow, that's really, that's a huge amount of time. How did you arrive at that particular dosage for the program?
Well, actually, the thing is, the program was designed based on habits, from Andy Gordon team, where they had 90, they tested 60 hours versus 90 hours, and they decided finally to go for 90 hours because at follow-up, they had better scores. So it means after 60 or 90, you basically have at the end of the training the same results, but you have a better values at follow-up if you use 90 hours, because it looks like the 30 additional hours help really to make the new task automatic and to keep it in time.
Right.
So that's why we decided to go for 90 hours. Although it's true in Colombia, they do it over 3 weeks.
Okay.
So in HABIT, which is just bimanual. And here we decided to go for 10 days in one row. That was because we actually started with sleepover camp. And as children were sleeping on the spot of the camp and were not really used to be apart from their families, it was really hard to imagine with something longer. 9 hours a day is a lot, but that was really to kind of shorten the period where they were sleeping with us.
Right, okay. There's a bit of a history there.
That's really interesting. Thank you for explaining it. Yeah, that's really useful. And Yannick, can you talk us through the assessments you were using to measure, I suppose, change over time with the program?
Yeah. So in this study, we focus mainly on assessment of upper extremities because the task we did in the fMRI was a manipulative task. So what we would see as changes in the brain was actually related to manipulation. So the assessment we used were manual dexterity assessment, which is the box and block, very simple test in which you pass some blocks from one part to another of a box, and we just count in 1 minute how many blocks can be passed from one side to the other. We also used stereognosis test, so the manual form perception test. It's a test in which you have to recognize some shapes and some usual objects without looking at the object, just by touching them. We also used a questionnaire of manual ability filled by the parents, which is called the HABIT-ILE kit. And of course, we used the assisting hand assessment. So the assisting hand assessment is a videotape assessment in which the child plays a game, and there are a lot of bimanual activities in the game. And what will be scored is the way the more affected hand will use the less affected hand in all the bimanual activities that are presented in the game.
Wow.
So these were basically our assessments, and of course the fMRI.
Yes, of course, yes. And that's quite a large component of the study, looking at changes in the fMRI. So we know that F stands for functional. So how does a functional MRI differ to just your standard MRI?
So actually, MRI and fMRI are both techniques that use magnetic fields and radio waves to reconstruct images of the brain. The main difference between them is that MRI measures the structure of the brain, let's say the anatomy, right? While fMRI, functional MRI, will measure the function, so the activity of the brain.
Right.
Here we measured actually brain activity during manipulative tasks performed without visual feedback. It means children had to manipulate small objects without looking at these objects. And this could be performed with the more affected or the less affected, or with both hands together.
Gosh, that's cool.
It is very cool. And people I've spoken to previously who have embarked on studies that use fMRI, I know a big part of the discussion is always about the stimulus that you use in the MRI to try and elicit that response you're looking for in the brain. So how did you decide on the task you were going to use in the MRI?
that was a very, very hard discussion. We had to think a lot about it because, if you make a big movement of your upper extremity in an MRI, you will induce some movement of your head also, especially if you have an affected hand where the movements are quite global. Then you will start the movement, and then there will be a movement of your head, and then it will provide some noise, and you cannot use the data. So we decided to do a task that was quite close to stereognosis. So we had some small shapes, either, I think it was circle or triangles, 3D shapes, very small one. And the child was lying with his hand along his body, hands open as much as possible. And we were just putting the small shapes in one hand or the other, or in both. And the child had to manipulate in his hand, her hand, the shape, and say what it is. And if it was in both hands, the child had to say whether it was the same in both hands. So it allowed to have manipulation and the sensori-motor aspect of it, but to prevent many, many movements that would be done if the child had to pick an object in a higher position or something like that.
Yeah.
Clever.
Such a balance, isn't it?
That would be really hard.
Okay, so after you went through that, very large process of trying to, get all of these children through the fMRI, at the start and the end of the intervention. And by the way, I think it's really impressive that of the 29 children, you managed to get data for 25 of them. That's incredible. Can you tell us a bit about the results from the fMRI? What did it show you?
Yeah. So the results of the fMRI actually showed first a network, so fronto-parietal network, also involving the cerebellum, that was there pre and post HABIT-ILE, and this network really corresponds to the motor skill learning activity network identified in adults without lesion.
Wow.
So that was a very interesting first result, is that although there is a lesion, actually it's exactly the same network that is involved.
That's incredible. Wow. Huh.
And and after intervention, we had, I would say, 3 different kind of situation, because we tested the more affected, the less affected hand, and both hands together. And we have, of course, results for each of these situations. So when the children used their more affected hand, what we observed is a decrease of activity on the motor cortex of the non-lesional hemisphere, and an increase of activity in the motor area of the lesional hemisphere.
Wow.
Okay.
Yes.
So when they use the more affected hand, it looks like we have a differential effect of the therapy on both hemispheres.
Yeah.
Wow.
When the task is performed with the less affected hands, what we clearly see is a decreased activity in the sensory-motor areas of the part of the brain controlling this less affected hand, so the non-affected hemisphere.
Huh.
And finally, when the task is performed with both hands together, we observed an increase of activity in both hemispheres.
God, that's really cool.
So that's a kind of summary of the fMRI results.
It is. Yeah. Gosh, the fact that you can summarize it that way is amazing, because when you do look at your paper, you have these wonderful tables, but it's very detailed with all the different parts that you did look at. So it was very thorough.
Yeah.
Yannick, what's the most interesting about all of that is, I guess, what it actually means from a motor learning, perspective and therapy, because to know that you have this differential effect between the more affected and the less affected, the fact that, you can see this differential effect is really interesting. But what did you take from it? Like, what do these results actually mean?
So what does it mean? It means first, I think that's a very important point, that our kids with unilateral CP, they do have the same motor learning network as we can find in anyone. And so that's very important, because it means that, and this network is likely to change with training. So that's the first thing. And how can we explain the changes we observed? A first thing is that probably the changes that we observe in brain activation after intervention are probably linked to some ultrastructural changes. These changes can include some modification in the dendritic architectures or synaptic strengths. So these kind of changes, they have been shown in animal studies after intensive intervention. But, we can hypothesize this happens here, but we are at a more macroscopic level when we observe activity of the brain. So we think it's what is going on, but we cannot exactly point it based on activity. We can just infer this from our results.
Yeah. And Yannick, the changes that you saw, were they reinforced by those measures of dexterity that you used as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So we had, we didn't pass through this, but actually, we had changes in the behavioral assessment. So in the AHA and the HABIT-ILE kids, actually, we had a significant improvement in the box and block, which is manual dexterity. We had some improvement on the less affected hand and a trend on the more affected hand. And in stereognosis, we improved on the more affected hand only. And what we saw is that some of the changes in fMRI were actually related to the behavioral changes.
Yeah. There's a few things that I have from that, Yannick. I've just been pondering as you've been talking. There's a lot of pondering. So the first part that you made about the changes, in terms of what you would expect to see from a motor learning perspective and the change you see in the brain is how you'd expect for everyone who's learning, to me is so encouraging, because we can therefore all relate to how our children with cerebral palsy are learning new skills. Like we can understand that, when you give the context of learn how to drive a car, for me, teaching someone how to play piano, that graduated, that incremental practice, it's specific, you're motivated, it's intensive, but it's most importantly, you're motivated to want to do it. It's the same for our children. And I think that to me is so encouraging, because we can therefore all relate, and it just makes it so much easier to explain this process to everyone. And the other... you talk about that one, because otherwise I'll keep talking. I've got so many thoughts.
I really think so. And what is really nice is that, this network, actually it has, of course, you will always think about movement and you think of the primary motor cortex, and of course the somatosensory areas related. But actually in this network, you find also the supplementary motor area, for instance, which is associated with movement planning. And you will also find the premotor cortex, which is associated with the selection and initiation of voluntary movement. And you find also the cerebellum.
Yes.
And the cerebellum is associated with adaptation regarding the environment.
Yes.
So actually, it means that it's not only the movement per se, but a lot of other things that are needed for the movement that are included in this network and that are likely to change with such intensive interventions.
That's incredible.
It is, because it's like you say, it's not just about the movement, it's all of the planning to move and all of the different areas of the brain that are involved in that are responsive to this intervention as well.
God, and you know how we keep talking about, that self-initiated movement, self-generated movement, it's such a key factor. And the reason why it's such a key factor is not because of the desire, but it's all the planning that goes into the movement. We never just go into movement just like that. We plan to go into it.
Yeah, it's all these pathways that you have to nurture.
Yeah. And that's part of neuroplasticity. Wow, that's so good.
Dana's buzzing.
I'm buzzing.
You can probably hear it.
I can barely sit still because I'm with Tigger and I'm just bouncing about like Tigger at this point. So the other point here, Yannick, that I thought it was worth bringing up, you said about the tests that you did, box and blocks, a lot of the functional tests that a lot of therapists would have in their toolbox. And if they're measuring these children, before and after an intensive intervention, and you've seen a significant change, could we presume, for following all these principles, that they're likely to be seeing these neuroplastic changes as well? Because obviously we don't all have fMRIs.
No.
But how can we interpret that data from the perspective of, because everyone talks about neuroplasticity. We're trying to promote neuroplasticity, but we can't show them for each child. But we have the outcome measures, right?
Yeah.
Well, we've got the outcome measures.
That's hard to say. I would say probably yes. But in our assessments, some of them were related to the changes in activation, and some were not really especially related. So I would say probably depends on which assessments you use. And also brain activity is not the only thing that changes during intensive intervention. So we have some other studies in which we can really show that there is a change in the structure of the corticospinal tract, which is also related to some other assessments. So yes, I would say that probably when you see a significant change, it is probably related to some neuroplastic changes, but to which it is related, that's not for sure. It might be change in activity, like here, but it might also be changes in the speed of the information passing from one part to another of the brain, because you improve white matter connectivity, for instance.
Yeah. And Yannick, this might be a tricky question for you to answer, but I'm thinking about the therapists who will be listening to this and, wondering about the fact that, it's not always feasible for them to be able to offer intensive therapy at a dose that kind of replicates what you were able to do in HABIT-ILE. But I suppose, how can they maximize the time that they do have with the children that they see to really start to, engage these principles of motor learning and hopefully start to see those changes in neuroplasticity?
Well, I think that Yeah, this is a concern, right? For me, this is a concern because it's true that we want things to be transferred in clinical practice. And the model that is presented here, like 90 hours with 9 hours a day, it's like not doable in clinical practice. We agree on that. It might be, well, there are two different things. So you can think about distributing the amount of hours in a different way. Like for 3 weeks, 6 hours a day, that's more doable if you have a center working with intensive boost of training, right? And lower dosages are currently tested, like 65 hours over 2 weeks, but we still don't know. We don't have the results yet for HABIT-ILE with that dosage. In studies focusing on upper extremity, a minimal dosage of around 40 hours has been suggested, defined, to induce motor changes. That's part of the work of Lian Zaczewski. But at this dosage, for upper extremity intervention, we have no really an idea of the potential neuroplastic changes. I would tend to think that there are some. Would they be exactly the same as those presented in this paper? I don't know. But I think that in any way, even if you don't have the 40 hours or whatever, the implementation of the ingredients of motor skill learning in a context with motivation and intensity, I would say, motor engagement time while the people are working with the child. So it means not having like breaks in between two games or activity presenting, but really having a high engagement intensity during practice, whatever the dosage of practice, plus self-generated movement in this positive environment where there is motivation and progressive increase in difficulty towards functional goal, then you have the good ingredients. At which dosage will they be induce neuroplasticity? That's the answer I cannot provide because I don't know. But at least we can try to, apply the ingredients that we know should drive neuroplasticity.
And maximize the time that you have.
That's a really good point.
Exactly.
And I think on that, my last conversation I had with, Professor Ros Boyd and Lian Zaczewski, they were starting to say, look, in terms of the hours, don't know about the time, but it's more important about getting the right ingredients, because you could do 3 weeks at 6 hours a day, but if you're not doing the right ingredients of self-generated movements, goal-directed, then that time really doesn't mean anything because you're not actually engaging in the way that you could. So I do love how you've come back to that to go, okay, this is the context of research. For the sake of research, this is what we want to find out, and dosage and all these parts put together. But my take on from that is like, do the right ingredients and maximize what you can actually do. That is all the principles that you spoke about, because time is irrelevant if you're not doing the right ingredients, I guess.
Yeah, I completely agree.
That's so great, Yannick. Yeah.
So Yannick, where to from here? What's next for you and this work? I'm sure you've got lots planned and lots underway already.
I bet you do.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about what's keeping you busy?
So, I would say there are two main, from this work, there are two main orientation that we took. The first one was to investigate this in young children and very young children. So we have had a large study for children with unilateral and bilateral CP from 1 to 4 years old. With systematically MRI before and after. So we can really see, but that won't be fMRI because they're too young. That will be more the structure of the brain, so investigating gray and white matter changes. And we are nearly done with that. And we have another study where we investigated children from 6 months to 18 months.
Wow.
And there we worked with some engineers to go more deeply in the microstructure of the brain. So really how the white matter structure is modified by the intervention. So I would say that's one part of what we do for now. And on the other side, we have started to investigate how to potentially help the implementation of HABIT-ILE in a home context, using a virtual reality device and having the parents with the child and remote supervision. So that's kind of what we do for now.
Oh, gosh. Okay.
And you say that like it's not very much at all, but actually that sounds like it's quite a lot.
Well, we look forward to speaking with you about many of those. So
stuff,
we will be chatting with you. But I know it sounds like I'm saying goodbye, but we're not done yet. So everyone hold their horses, because here we go into the next segment, which is called Tell It to Ed. Ed, as you know, is our producer. He doesn't have a background in child health, but he has been listening to this whole episode, and I can almost guess what question he's going to go for this one. I'm gonna hedge my bets. We do not prep him in any way, and so this question that will come from him will be completely self-generated question from Ed. But before he does that, Yannick, can you give us a 60-second summary for someone who doesn't have a background in child health about this research?
Okay. Wow. So, well, I would say that this study showed that a child-friendly intensive intervention based on motor skill learning can induce changes in the brain activity of children with a unilateral brain lesion. And this can be measured with a functional MRI and show that the activity in the brain can increase, especially in the part of the brain with a lesion, when the children use their affected hand, or the activity in the brain while using both hands, or the less affected hand. Using the more affected hand or while using both hands, so you can have an increase, and this activity can also decrease when the less affected hand of the child is used. The changes in activity are not the same in all children, and this is probably explained by the fact that some of the children are at the first stage of their learning process, and so their brain activation increases, while others are in a later stage, and therefore their brain activity declines upon mastery of the task. What is also interesting is that the changes are observed in a large amount of brain area, including the typical area for motor control, but also some area more related to cognitive control or attention, suggesting that these abilities could likely also be modified by an intensive motor intervention.
God, when you go there, that was amazing.
Yeah.
Gosh.
Wow.
Oh, wow.
Go, Ed.
Okay, Ed, are you ready for your question?
Oh, I'm definitely not ready.
It started off so confidently.
Come on, it sounds so weird.
Long story made very short for all of our listeners. I tend to take notes through the course of these podcasts, and I kind of make a checklist of what possible questions I could ask. And as I'm making my list on this particular episode, I think every single one of my questions was getting ticked off. Obviously, it's super exciting to hear about these advances in healthcare, and I was interested in how it can become integrated into clinical practice. I think that got touched on. And then you were talking about the 60 and the 90 hours, and whether smaller dosages might might be more realistic or doable in a clinical environment, and you kind of touched on that as well.
Sorry, Ed.
So I think I'm going to move my question a little bit further down the track, and it's probably a very, very silly one. I know that this study obviously relates to a lot of younger children and how neuroplasticity kind of works in developing brains. I'm curious about how this type of therapy translates to older children. Is there diminishing returns, obviously, based on how old children are, and is there any evidence there about like the length of time? Like, would they need to do more hours of therapy to get a similar kind of response, if that's even possible, or should it be in shorter, more frequent doses? I don't know if that's a silly question.
No, I think it's a good question. We should have asked it.
Yeah.
No, it's actually an excellent question.
Oh, I'm feeling much better.
Well, regarding older children, in this study we had children from 6 to 16, and we tried to make some correlation between the amount of activity change and age, and we couldn't find anything. And in another study where we were assessing the change in the white matter tracts, especially in the corticospinal tract, where there is an improvement, we also tried, and there were also no correlation with age. And in the behavioral assessment, there is also no difference between the youngest and the oldest children in that kind of study. So it is, I think that probably neuroplasticity is a bit lower in older children, but when older children come to this kind of camp, actually, children, teenagers like 14, 15, 16 years old, 17, they know exactly why they are there, and they absolutely want to reach their goals. And so they're such hard workers that I think they've got much, much more repetition than younger children. And in my opinion, this might compensate because they actually do such a hard job in pushing with intensity by themselves that it compensates for maybe a small difference in, let's say, basic neuroplastic possibilities.
Wow. That's actually a really good question. I'm glad you capped that off, and that was a wonderful answer.
Yeah,
that was really good all round. Well done, Ed. Well done.
I'm not sure I remember there was a second part, but I
think you covered it beautifully. Yeah, that was absolutely amazing. Well,
okay.
Goodness me, I'll be thinking about this episode for quite some time. I absolutely loved that.
So did I. I always love learning more about the brain.
Yeah.
And thank you for being such a good teacher, Yannick.
Wonderful teacher.
You're welcome.
That was just brilliant. To all of our listeners, remember you can get access to this article on researchworks.net. I really do encourage you to have a look at it. It is absolutely brilliant. And of course, there's a CPD form there that you can fill out as well if you want to keep this as part of a record of your PD requirements. But for now, thank you so very, very much. It was just brilliant. Brilliant. My brain's all activated now. I can see it.
Wow, thanks a lot for having me. That was very nice.
Oh, fabulous.
Oh, we loved having you. Thanks, Yannick. Make sure you come back and update us on all the other work you're doing.
Yes, please. Many, many more episodes with you. Thank you so much for everyone for tuning in. We'll talk to you all again next time. Bye.
Bye.